Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. As you can see in this particular episode, we're going to be shrinking down the size of the trees that we've been working on lately. We're going to create some Shohin size Shimpaku Juniper bonsai. So one of the big projects that we're working on here at Eisei-en in Nashville, Tennessee is creating some Shohin size material going into the future. We're going to be doing this with black pines, maples, junipers, and a number of other species. But in this particular video, what I want to do is talk to you guys about how to create Shohin Itoigawa Shimpaku junipers. So for those of you who don't know, Itoigawa is a naturally occurring variety of Junipers chinensis, comes from the Niigata prefecture in Japan, and more specifically, the best examples of Itoigawa yamadori or collected trees in Japan really all came from or come from the Kurohime Mountain, which translates to the Black Princess Mountain, which is a pretty ominous and cool sounding name if you ask me. Now what you see in front of you here are actually a couple different cultivars of Itoigawa Shimpaku Juniper. These would have been taken as cuttings off of trees that were actually naturally occurring and collected in the Niigata area of Japan and selected specifically for the type of foliage or the fineness of the foliage. So if you look at the tree on your left here, this is, and the one in the center here are actually both the same species here. They were actually taken as cuttings from the same parent plant, so they're exactly the same genetically identical plants. Whereas the one on the far left here is slightly different. This was taken as a cutting off of a different collected Itoigawa Shimpaku, and it's got a little bit more of a fine foliage to it. But in any case, they're all Juniperus chinensis variety or cultivar Itoigawa. Now before we actually jump into creating these Shohin bonsai here, I want to talk to you guys about what that term Shohin actually means. Now as it's related to bonsai art in Japan, it's a specific size category and it refers to trees that are under 20 centimeters or 8 inches in height as measured from the top of the pot to the apex of the tree. The next size category up would be something called kifu. These are trees that are about 21, 22 centimeters, so about 9 inches tall, up to about 28 to 30 centimeters, so almost up to a foot tall, so somewhere in that range. The next size category is what's called chuhin, or medium-sized trees. These are trees that are above about 30 centimeters or a foot, up to about 45 centimeters or a foot and a half, again, measured from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. And the final size category would be something called ogata bonsai. These are trees that are above about that 45 centimeter mark. Now, if you go to the Kokufu in Japan, which is the Japanese National Exhibition, you'll notice that there aren't very many trees that are between 45 centimeters and say about 60 centimeters in height, so about a foot and a half to 2 feet in height. That height would be considered an ogata bonsai, but in the Kokufu, that size range ends up getting swallowed out by the much larger trees in the show. So really for the ogata category, you're only going to find trees that are typically above about 60 centimeters or 2 feet in height. Now, specifically, since we're talking about Shohin bonsai here, I want to make sure that you guys are aware that it refers to a size category. It means trees that are under 8 inches or 20 centimeters in height. Now, what makes that really cool is that it's a very difficult thing to create a Shohin size tree and maintain it at that size. As a matter of fact, trees that are initially created at that Shohin size over time, because they elongate, because the trunks thicken, because they get bigger, they tend to move up to that next size category of kifu, which is a little bit, in Japan anyway, less desirable in the Shohin because the Shohin is so hard to create and maintain at that size. Now what I want to explain in this video is how we're going to take raw material, so cuttings of Itoigawa Shimpaku, and then turn them into those true Shohin trees. Now I want to start with the tree on my right here, so your left. This is a 3-year-old cutting. This was a cutting off of a large Itoigawa that was again imported from Japan. And as you can see, it's very straight. The trunk diameter is about the size of a pencil. As a matter of fact, it's got 2 trunks on here, 2 lower branches that have both elongated out to become trunks essentially, both of which are about the diameter of a pencil. If you look at the tree in the middle here, this is a 4 to 5-year-old cutting, again off of that same genetically identical plant as the first tree here, but this tree has actually been twisted up and contorted using wire. Now what I would typically do is with a tree that's on my right here, about this size, this would be about the stage where I'd apply that wire, and then when you get to this stage in the center here, this is about the time to remove the wire. Now if you look at the tree on my left here, your right, this particular tree is about 7 or 8 years into the process. So it started out looking like this. By about the third year, it was wired. So by the time we got to the fourth or fifth year, it looked like the tree in the center here. And now that we're at the seventh or eighth year, it looks like this. The wire's been removed from the tree, the trunk is thickened up significantly, and we've got a lot of fine branches to work with to create a nice, compact, little Shohin-sized tree. So what I want to do is show you what it looks like taking a tree like this, how to prune it, how to wire it, how to bend the branches, and then we're going to take this tree that's ready to be styled now as a bonsai, and we're going to put the initial bends and the initial shari in the tree. So let's jump into it. So before we start cutting on this tree, I want to explain a little bit about what's going on with the color of the foliage here. Now we're doing this styling in late December here in Nashville, Tennessee, so we're right in the midst of winter. Now you can actually do this type of styling just about any time of the year, but the reason that the foliage looks this color right now is because we're in the middle of winter. This is what's called shimoyake in Japanese. It's basically frostburn on the tree. So Itoigawa in nature and in a cultivated form in a bonsai nursery, for example, if they are exposed to cold temperatures below freezing, so below 32, below zero, you're going to get what's called shimoyake, or this purple coloration of the foliage. Sometimes it'll turn purple like this, sometimes it'll turn a little bit more of a brownish color. You'll actually see a similar effect with hinoki cypress and several other coniferous species as well during the winter months. But this is not something to be concerned about, and we can still do this type of bending on these small whips this time of year. Now, if you're doing heavy bending on older junipers, particularly collected trees like the one behind me here, I don't recommend that you do massive heavy bends right in the middle of the coldest part of winter. But again, with young trees like this, it should be no problem at all. This is only a 3-year-old cutting, so I'm not worried about any deleterious effects to the plant by doing heavy bending at this time of year. Now, the first thing I want to do in the process here before we put any wire on the tree is go through and remove unnecessary foliage. Well, you'll notice that there's not a lot of foliage on this to begin with, so we're not going to be cutting really much of anything off. But what I do want to cut off are these small pieces down here right at the base. Those are going to get in the way of the wire when we actually apply it to the whips or to the trunks here. So just going through and removing these down here at the base. And we've also got a little bit of juvenile foliage here in a couple of areas. I'm gonna go ahead and remove those as well. They're not really gonna serve much purpose in the long run. Plus they're just gonna get in the way as we start to apply the wire. Now you'll notice that I'm pulling foliage away by hand here. I'm not technically pinching the foliage on this tree. You never want to pinch the foliage on your junipers because you're going to end up damaging the foliage essentially. The reason being is that each and every tip here, all of these tips of foliage contain a hormone called auxin, AUXIN. If you go through and pinch all of those off, for example, you grab the foliage, you take it and you rip through it, what you're going to end up with is removing all of that auxin and all of these tips. You're essentially telling that branch to stop growing, and it's going to peter out over time and die off, or at least be very unhealthy and very weak. So what I'm actually doing here is I am removing foliage by hand, but I'm removing foliage back to the undersides of some of these branches here and actually leaving the main stem. So I'm not ripping through the foliage, I'm actually completely removing it. So there's a difference there. So don't get confused with me pulling by hand here and what I mean by deleterious pinching on a juniper. You definitely don't want to pinch a juniper. So again, I'm going through here, just removing a little bit of that underside foliage to the branches here, cleaning out a few of the crotches so we can get the wire in here a little bit more easily, and then we'll apply the wire to the tree. Okay, so now that we've removed the unnecessary foliage for the most part here, we can actually wire this tree up. Now you can use either copper or aluminum wire. It doesn't really matter at this stage. I tend to prefer with conifers to use copper wire though. It tends to hold a little bit better in the long run, so that's what we're going to be doing on this particular tree here. Now, the size wire that I'm using here, we're going to be using a size 10 and a size 12, just based on the diameter of both of these trunks right here. So I'll be using a size 10 on this side and a size 12 on this side. But in order to anchor these wires properly, we're actually going to have to stick the end of the wire down into the soil here. So this pot is about a 4.5, 5-inch tall pot, so we got a lot of room to actually stick that wire down into the base. So I'm going to take the largest wire first here. This is that size 10 wire. I'm going to cut a piece that's basically about 1/3 longer than the actual length of that trunk. We're going to take this here, I'm going to stretch it out a little bit. What I'm going to do now is actually stick this down into the base of the soil here. I'm going to insert that essentially as far down as it'll go. So that's essentially hitting the bottom of the pot at this point. And now I can take this wire up onto the trunk here. Now, since we're going to be doing some pretty heavy-duty bending on this, I'm actually going to make the pitch of this wire relatively tight. The books in general that you read on bonsai will tell you to make the pitch of the wire when you're applying it at about a 45-degree angle. Well, when you're dealing with most coniferous material, that ends up being a little bit too tight. It ends up looking a bit like a slinky or a spring. Looks quite messy. So as a general rule of thumb, we stretch that out quite a bit more. But again, since we're going to be putting some major crazy bends in this thing, I'm going to make this pitch right at that 45 recommended angle. So I'm going to take this all the way up as far as possible here onto this main trunk. That's a little bit hard to support here because the pot has no weight to it. So it's kind of moving around a little bit, but that's all right. I'm being very careful not to crush the smaller branches and foliage as I get towards the top of the tree here. I don't want anything to get caught underneath that wire. As you can see here, we get to the top and we've got just a little bit left. So that extra third of the length here ended up being just about right. Okay, so now that we've got that side on, we're going to wire the other side with that size 12 here. So again, I'm going to cut this wire about a third longer than the length of that branch or that trunk. Again, we're going to stick this down into the soil as far as it'll go. Take that out onto the branch here. Again, I'm going to keep that pitch essentially the same angle as the original trunk here, so about a 45-degree angle. And I'm trying to avoid crushing the foliage again. Okay, so we'll take that out to the very end here, cut it off. Now you'll notice here too, we've got a couple of smaller branches that are lignified or woody. Those I'm actually going to apply wire to as well. But what I don't want you guys to do is over-apply wire and apply it to every single little bitty branch on here. That's not necessary. Only the branches that are lignified. So in the case of this tree, we've got one here, let's say one here. We've got maybe one or two on the other trunk here. So I'm going to apply a little bit thinner wire to those branches. That way we can twist those up. Perhaps they get cut off in the future. Perhaps they become gin features on the tree. But let's get that wire on there as well. Okay, so this is what the tree should look like once you have it wired. Pretty simple, very minimal, not too many wires on the plant at all. Now, the next step is going to be to start to twist this tree, and I want to start with the main trunk line here. Really, when you're doing this, you don't really necessarily need to think too much about what the final design is going to be. The idea is that we're trying to mimic nature to some degree. So if you look at junipers out in the mountains, Yamadori, what you want to do is try to mimic that look. Those trees have a lot of contorted motion to them. There's no real rhyme or reason to the direction of the trunks. Sometimes they'll go clockwise and then they'll switch back to counterclockwise. So we're going to try to get that same sort of effect out of this by not really thinking too much about what the final design is going to be, because a lot of these branches are going to be left to elongate, to thicken. Perhaps we turn some of them into gins, perhaps they come completely off, perhaps some of them become new trunks on the tree. So there really is no rhyme or reason to this. But you'll notice here that on both of these trunks, I actually put the wire on here clockwise. So I'm going to start at the base by twisting both of these clockwise. As we get further out on the branch, we may rotate that back in a counterclockwise direction to give us more interest and motion in the trunk. So I'm going to start down here. We're going to grab this and twist quite severely here. And as I do this, this trunk, the secondary trunk, is getting in the way, so I'm going to have to move it out of the way to be able to get this in the position that I want here. And I'm not trying to create an S shape here. I'm trying to create as much odd contorted motion as possible. All right, so up to about this point, we're going clockwise. Now I'm going to switch this back and go counterclockwise the other direction here. We're just going to lay this back in on itself, twist it again. Now we're clockwise again. And we smash that together. All right, so that's one side here, all wired up. Now we'll do something similar with the other trunk here. Now when you're doing multiple trunks like this, you do want them to somewhat mimic each other to some degree. You don't want them to be exactly the same, but you don't want them to be so disparate and weird looking that it's going to be hard to utilize both of them in the design later. So I'm going to try to sort of mimic and follow that same general pattern as the first trunk here. So a lot of motion right from the base of the tree, which is key. We really want that motion to start right from the base, particularly since we're turning these into Shohin-sized trees. If there's any section of the trunk that's straight, it's going to stand out and look a bit strange when we get to that final design a few years later. So we want to really twist and bend right from the base. All right, now we can take those secondary branches, add some crazy motion to those. So again, twisting them clockwise, counterclockwise, back on themselves. Not really thinking too much about what that final design is going to be. All right, so essentially we've compacted a tree that was about, say, 14 inches tall, so what's that, 32 centimeters, 35 centimeters, somewhere in that range, down to a tree that's well under that 20 centimeter mark. This is only about, so let's say 5 inches to 6 inches tall, so 13 to 15 centimeters tall. It's been compressed back down. And now we're essentially just going to leave this tree alone for the next couple of years while this wire starts to bite in slightly. We don't want it to bite in too much, but we do want it to bite in some. It'll help create some scar tissue on the branches and the trunks and hold them into place, but it'll also start to build essentially a live vein type effect, so a spiral effect up the branches that we can then turn into shari versus a live vein that's feeding the foliage. So this tree will stay in this pot for one more growing season. It'll be fertilized pretty heavily. The following year, it'll be up potted to a slightly larger pot, and it'll actually be put in an air pot or a net pot or a colander, so something that provides a lot of aeration and oxygen to the root system of the tree, which will cause the tree to grow significantly faster. So for the time being, this is what we want this tree to look like. So we're going to set this one aside, and we're going to jump into styling that 7 or 8 year old cutting that's already had the initial bends established in the trunk and in the branches.
Yes.